Yeah, so well, I am by training an architect and urban designer, but I haven't done any architecture in a very long time. Though urban design, urban planning is what I still do professionally for public projects. But working on children's environments, and particularly this thing of, I don't know whether you've heard of this thing called child-friendly cities, which the UN had after the Habitat 2 conference in 1996. It was developed as an idea. So around that time I had done my master's in urban design, and I attempted this thing of, at that time, you know, these participatory processes were not so well known, but some bug bit me, and I decided that for my master's thesis I'm going to look at whether it is possible to design neighborhoods with children, you know, get them involved in the design process. So that was really the starting point of my journey in children's environments, and over the years many different work with many organizations. So this is this sort of in a way shaped our work on affordable housing, and it's very topical right now to talk about it, simply because we are now talking mega numbers with this new Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, affordable housing for all, which actually builds on a lot of the framework of BSUP. So it will be interesting to know what the predecessor accomplished and failed at, to see what we could do differently second time round when given a second opportunity. And of course, this children's thing is not really on the agenda, but we try very hard to advocate for it. So we are also right now trying to develop a lot of work, you know, in the follow up to Habitat 3 with UNICEF. We are actually their ACE is their chief technical partner in urban programming, which UNICEF is getting involved in after 20 years in India. So we are starting with this thing of promoting bottom up safe communities in slums, and we are piloting that in Mumbai and Bhopal, and we are starting a third city in very soon. And we also do some work around urban children and climate change in Asian cities with the Rockefeller Foundation and the ACER network that Terry was also a part of. But for today's presentation, I thought it would be interesting to talk about this, because since a lot of you are from water sanitation, because we did look at that, but there was also a very strong conceptual framework for looking at this. I'm not going to go into this. We all know what JNURM was, 65 mission cities, the two focus, urban governance and infrastructure, and basic services to the urban poor. So affordable housing was inside the basic services to the urban poor. This is, we at that time were very excited, because we felt that there was a very strong synergy between the objectives and goals of BSUP and what child rights in the urban context of child-friendly cities talks about. So we said, oh, you know, if this is implemented right, it would actually improve the lives of the most marginalized slum-dwelling children in India. So we were very excited. And what those synergies are, when we actually unpacked the goals of BSUP and interpreted it with a child rights framework. Come in. So, you know, the main sort of goals were commitment to security of tenure, which is sort of the first thing that this affordable housing mission talked about. And this is very strongly committed to children in the rights of the child in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which, by the way, is the most ratified UN convention ever. Only 3 countries have not ratified it, and those countries are Somalia, South Sudan, and the United States. These are the only 3 countries that haven't ratified it, but everyone else has. So it is the most powerful convention that the UN has. Then improved housing, which is very much enshrined in Article 27, which is the right to an adequate standard of living. Water supply and sanitation, which is strongly linked to right to health. Article 24, education, Articles 28, 29. So there were very, very strong synergies, and we were very, very excited to see this. So having done that analysis, we also realized that this, as I said before, actually presents an unprecedented opportunity for improving lives of slum dwelling children in India. But we were also concerned at the same time, because there is typically an understanding in policy think tanks that if you improve water, sanitation, housing, whatever in slum dwellers in general, it improves everybody's lives. That may be partially true, but it is not fully true, particularly for the most marginalized of children, because children's needs are pretty specific and they are impacted by urban deficiencies in certain ways in which adults are not impacted in such ways. First of all, a child in poverty is impacted by the very fact that you are growing up in an informal settlement, etc. It's a much deeper deprivation than for an adult, because once you miss the chance to be educated, once you miss the chance to a healthy start in life, your whole life sets you back. So, there is a very strong commitment within the rights framework to do right by the child, to take care of these deprivations at a very early stage so that it does not perpetuate across the life cycle. So, having said that, so we were very interested in seeing that there is very little understanding of what these non-negotiables should be, or why we should even be considering children in the slum redevelopment, affordable housing space, etc. So, this was really the starting point of this project. So, we decided to look at case studies of implemented projects, BSUP projects, which were considered to some extent the best practices, the good examples across India. And so, we were working in Bhopal, Bhubaneswar, Kalyani, which is in the Calcutta metropolitan area, Nagpur, Pune and Trivandrum, and we looked at 8 projects. And as it so happened, it just happened like that, we did not plan it, that they neatly fitted into typologies. 4 of these projects were the flatted building typology, which had been the predominant model of doing slum redevelopment in India across the municipalities. And the second was this in situ incremental plotted housing, which happened in some areas with intense NGO participation in most cases. And so, the first one, Karimadam redevelopment, actually is the most awarded BSUP project in India. It had won environmental awards, the HUDCO Best Design Award, many awards, you know. It is in the heart of Trivandrum, and it is the most notorious slum of Trivandrum. It's really where the drug trade of the city is controlled from. And so, it was a very dangerous environment, etc., we were told. And of course, I must also say that none of these projects, even though they had achieved a certain level of completion, none of them were actually completed. And when we went to the field, we found that out, because the literature does not say that, a lot of the documentation does not say that. So, the framework of analysis that we used, you know, typically child rights are categorized into what we say the 3 Ps. Rights fall under protection rights, what we say, that every child has the right to be protected from every form of abuse, exploitation, etc., you know, of every kind. Provision rights, which is where you have to give them enough, you know, in terms of all the social opportunities, physical, environmental opportunities for development and survival. And then, of course, the right to participate in decision making in everyday life. So, this is 3 Ps approach, and we further unpacked provision rights because we are working within the housing space using the housing rights framework, which is again enshrined in, has been explored quite a bit in a general comment of the United Nations. And so, the housing rights framework actually is a 7-point thing. It talks about legal security of tenure, availability of services, materials, facilities and infrastructure, affordability, habitability, accessibility, location and cultural adequacy. And to that we also added, because one of the goals of this whole mission was sustainable development, the framework of whether the projects achieved any kind of economic sustainability, social sustainability or environmental sustainability. We didn't go too much into the protection rights, but we did find that there were several of these rights which were being violated in these slums for children, and one of the USPs of BSUP was convergence of not only housing delivery and infrastructure delivery, but also social services of health, education, civic amenities, etc., for proper development of the community. So, but we found that there was rampant substance abuse among young people in these communities, and there was absolutely no opportunities for any kind of rehab. None of the NGOs were working on it. There were no convergence between any kind of government programs, because there were several schemes around. Domestic violence, children were not very easy talking about it, but there was rampant violence within the homes, and there were, a very strong disregard for any, and of course there was also a lot of child sexual abuse, which were again not reported at all, and the mothers themselves will not allow the daughters to go and report it anywhere. And that's something that we are working on very strongly with in our current UNICEF project with many other partner NGOs, particularly in Mumbai. Inadequate, unhealthy, unsafe public spaces for particularly girls, because the focus of none of these projects had not been the public realm, but just the housing unit. Lack of attention to disability. Here in the 21st century, you have a flagship mission in which you are delivering, housing. None of these housing units actually had universal access of any kind. Lack of civic engagement of children and youth. Participation, participation, participation. It's all in the framework that it's all to be delivered through a participatory approach. Women's groups were involved, the Mahila Milans were involved, more than men, women were involved in many places where NGOs were active. But for example, in Trivandrum, there were very active Bal Sabhas. It's the only place where the women's groups are very, very strongly established, from the neighborhood level to the ward level to the area level and then to the corporation level, and they're federated. Children's group also have the similar structure, and these kids would even come for the meetings for when the decision making happened, the design and planning were discussed, but they were not allowed to say a word because it was considered rude of them if they talked when the adults were deliberating. And so there was and I'll come to this point later, in many places, in Pune we found, in Trivandrum we found that boys were actually much more at risk than girls, particularly at the age of 14, because typically by and large all families took loans to repay the beneficiary amount of the project, which was not very much, but still it was quite a lot for these people. So it was the boys, the adolescent boys, who were pulled out of school and they were put into work. A lot of them were working as labor in construction sites, they were working in meat shops and all kinds of places. So their right to education was gone, and so we found them, and in many places in Bhubaneswar we found they were working as mostly masons and construction workers and painters, etc. We did a focus group with the boys, and there was this group of boys who were very tough looking and they were all hardcore drug addicts. And for the focus group we had these two boys, first year engineering students from the Bhubaneswar Engineering College. And so these boys of course wouldn't talk to the women. So after a while when they warmed up, and these boys were fantastic facilitators, these two young engineering students, surprisingly. And when they started talking beyond a point, these hard nuts all broke down and started crying. And this thing was that, what do I do? I see my father coming home, beating my mother, drinking, my uncles do that, everybody in my community do that. Do I have any other option? This is what I have learned. Like, I would like to be an engineer like you, I would like to go to engineering college. Tell me, how do I do that? So there were absolute absence of any kind of opportunities or role models or alternatives in their lives, which was very, very stark. And we felt that projects like this had an opportunity to do something about these kind of social realities. Malnutrition, again, extremely strong component of these projects was, in many cases the Anganwadis were targeted, but the condition of those Anganwadis was again something that was out of some medieval horror story. And again in Bhubaneswar there was this Anganwadi worker. Most of the places we found were running on rent, and the rents were much higher than what the government would pay. So the Anganwadi worker, in order to keep her job, would pay the deficit, the rent deficit, so that she has a government job. And then the allocation for each child was, I think, 2 rupees a meal or something, whereas they are supposed to give them nutritious food. So, and in certain, it's also cultural. Eastern part of the country, they want eggs, they want meat, etc. So everyone wanted an egg. So she said, how do I give an egg? It's 5 rupees, 6 rupees it costs. So she would buy an egg and she'll slice it 4 ways, and she would give it to children, distribute it. So she had this system of rotating. So once a week, a child will get 1/4 of an egg. So this was the kind of system that was prevalent, over there. And these are the stories that typically don't, of course, come out in the press, but these are stories which should be shaping how we actually design and program social policies in this country. So this I've discussed. This is the framework for the provisions. The first thing which was a mandate of this scheme was security of tenure, and across all these 8 slums and projects, we found that many times ownership certificates were given, and these were all mostly, but for the first 7 to 10 years of the project, those certificates, the original, stayed with the municipal corporation. They will not give you. So actually you have no ownership papers of your house. And in the case of Pune, which were actually very good projects, no ownership papers existed anywhere, because the section of the municipal corporation where all these BSUP ownership papers were kept got burnt down, and there was no records thereafter at all. The mantra, and we were there in Pune that day when the Mantralaya burnt, and next day we heard that that section where all the BSUP records were had vanished. The only places where we found people had any kind of security of tenure were in these 2 very poor slums, one in Bhubaneswar and one in Calcutta, Kalyani. That's because those people owned the land. Those slum dwellers actually owned the land. In the case of Kalyani, they came as refugees. This is very close to the Bangladesh border. So these people came in the 70s, and they were given very large plots, rehabilitation plots. These like 5 katta plots, which means it's around 3,000 square feet, which is a very large plot. And that has subsequently been subdivided. And in Nayapalli, because that's a tribal settlement, it's in the heart of Bhubaneswar. The entire redevelopment of that area, the stadium, some ecological complexes, etc., were built with these people's land, forest land, and they were given hardly any money as compensation, which they drunk away in a few years. So they are absolutely impoverished, and this resettlement scheme that came in, this one, so the only thing that they had was their land and nothing else. So they owned the land. So we all know what security of tenure is one of the biggest really problems in any kind of affordable housing project or slum redevelopment project in India, because land is the most critical asset. No one wants to give up that right. But for children, what happens is when a lot of these projects, particularly the flatted projects, are never without any kind of conflict, because there will definitely be X number of families who will resist moving to a flat because they want to stay in their slum houses, particularly the ones who have made it nice and who have a lot of area, and there are extended families, etc. So together they actually command a lot of area. So there were forced evictions. That was inevitable everywhere, and the psychological effects on children of forced eviction is extremely well documented in research, particularly for pre-verbal children. It actually has long-term impacts over their life cycle, and a lot of stressful behavior, bedwetting and those kind of things continue in children who have had no prior history of such post-traumatic stress syndromes, actually. Recurring nightmares, anxiety attacks, and this difficulty of establishing any kind of sense of belonging. In many places, like in Nagpur, we found the they had been put in transit camps, and because the land dispute was such, in fact, my opening screen had that image of the Jatrodi slum redevelopment in Nagpur. It was locked in a battle between the railways, the water board and the municipal corporation. So, initially when they started and it was a big international coalition of NGOs which worked on that project, they didn't know that the land was so disputed. So, they had demolished the houses, put these guys in transit camps, and then there was an injunction on the project by the railways. They didn't want to give their land away. So, these people have nowhere to go. They are still in transit camps because the project is now stalled. They cannot build any more housing, and it is again an award winning project. So, there are at least 30 families in transit camps with nowhere to go. So, these are also realities of projects like this, which does not foresee these kind of eventualities and what are the backup plans. Availability of infrastructure services. So, we looked at water, sanitation, drainage, garbage disposal, and in this, in terms of water, only in Karimadam, Kerala, there was like 24/7 water supply, and on the other extreme is Nayapalli, Bhubaneswar, which had no water supply. So, the toilets were used as stores or puja rooms, etc. And all the rest had differing ways of providing for water. For example, in Jatrodi, Nagpur, water supply was provided in the flats. People broke the connection because for the first time they had to pay for water. It was metered. They didn't want that. So, they broke the connections, and they would still go to the standpipe outside and queue up twice a day, get the water, and it was the young girls who would climb up 3 floors with the water on their head, etc. In many places, in Bhopal, it was very erratic, the water supply. So, they had to make elaborate arrangements for water storage inside the flats because it will come on every other day. Same in Pune and Gandhinagar, and both the slums that we looked at in Pune. In case of Kongar Nagar, this is in Kalyani, this again, Kalyani had again won many environmental awards. It is supposed to be the first open defecation free city in India. It is supposed to be, it had implemented the CLTS project, the community led oral sanitation projects very successfully. So, prior to BSUP, and because this was an incremental housing, pretty much every house had a self-built toilet. Through this, they tried to give them water, but look at where the water is provided. It is typically outside the house. The source of drinking water is on the wall of the bathroom. So, the family will not use it for cooking because it is culturally unacceptable, and it would be on next to a garbage dump or some very dirty place. So, they would still be resorting back to what they were doing before to provide for water. So, these are all very tokenist moves, because on paper the engineer would go and tick, yes, I provided water to so many homes, but where is the connection provided? How is the family supposed to use this water? Next we and then of course, like I said, because in the places where water supply was there, this is Karimadam. So, this is again, have you guys heard of a very famous architect called Laurie Baker, who was very famous for this exposed brick, a lot of beautiful low cost housing buildings across Trivandrum. This project was his unrealized dream. So, he had made a design for this and then he passed away. So, 15 years later, his NGO Cost Ford, they actually built this, and this was a slum redevelopment, right? There was a whole history to it anyway. But anyway, so this design obviously didn't have any water storage facilities. So, what they have done is they have gone and put these water tanks on top of these sloping roofs, which are not designed to carry extra load of water. Water has a lot of load on the slabs. So, it makes it very, very dangerous. And this is like from 4 years ago. Now, when I visited it a few months ago, this project, I mean pretty much everything had a water tank on top. Now, in Jatrodi, like I said, they had broken the water connections in their flats. Now, they are all using the community standpipe again. In Madrasi colony and Kalpana Nagar, this is how water is stored everywhere in the little balconies, wherever they can find space. Same story in Pune. This is in Kongar Nagar redevelopment. and this is Bhubaneswar because there is no community level house level water at all. So, they have to use the public standpipes, and it is typically you will see the children filling water, and they have a system which is very interesting. I do not know why they do not put the water in the bucket. They will have like 6 2-liter bottles, those soft drink bottles. So, they will put those 6 bottles inside the bucket, and each of these kids will be carrying 2 such bucket loads of, let us say, 12 to 24 liters of water, and they will do this many times a day. So, see, you will see that over there, the bucket full of these bottles. They do not put the water in the bottle, I do not know why, maybe it gets used up or gets dirty easily. But we all know what the impact of inadequate water supply is on children. Of course, the dream of BSUP had been to provide individual piped water in every house. When that does not get done, and when we talk to children across these sites, the projects like in Karimadam, girls especially talk about how their life has changed, and the biggest thing that they say, the biggest plus of the project is now they have water supply at home, so they do not have to go and stand in queue, and there is a lot of, and they have toilets at home, so they do not have to use the public toilet, because those were the 2 times where this whole thing of violence, sexual harassment, teasing, all that is when it happens the most. So, they were very, very happy about that, but in most places it was not happening. So, there are so many waterborne diseases, etc., diarrhea, jaundice, typhoid, intestinal thing, and 21% of communicable diseases in India are related to water sources, unsafe water. Sanitation, pretty much all the houses had toilets across the 8 slums, 7 of them did. It is only again in Nayapalli, because there is no water, there is no sanitation, and they had laid the pipe work, nothing was connected. So, the toilet is there, that outlet is hanging, they have dug pits over here and nothing, there is no connection provided even after 4-5 years of the the project. In some cases, in some of the affluent communities like in Pune and Karimadam, people had remodeled their toilets, and they are like toilets in middle class homes in a lot of cases. But again, this is so there is quite a lot of variation within this as well. We know that unless you have improved sanitation, you are not going to reduce the disease burden on the community, especially on children. And this is particularly true because it's now there's so much research which actually connects lack of sanitation to stunting, and stunting is again a proxy indicator for future productivity as adults, and it is also a proxy indicator for future GDP enhancement of a country. So, there is a no-brainer, and that's one of the the foundational logic behind the Swachh Bharat mission that we are looking at today. Drainage, huge problem. Even in places where water and sanitation had been taken care of, surface drainage is something that had been completely left unattended. Like for example, in Karimadam, this is still the condition of the public realm, where you have these open drains and the undeveloped part of the slums is still discharging directly into the drains that's flowing through. And in the sort of flatted housing also, it's all open drains everywhere. It's only in this one project, Gandhinagar, that we actually found the infrastructure of this particular slum is better than many middle class neighborhoods, and I'll come to that a little later because that was a standout case study. Everywhere else it's the same story, and in some cases the project actually directly made what was there worse. This is in Kalyani. So, part of the project was to lay these drains, these stormwater drains. So, what they did, and this is a in Kalyani is you guys should know that it is the first planned garden city of India, much before Chandigarh. In the 50s, Jawaharlal Nehru had set the sort of foundation stone early, right after independence, and it was built in the 50s. And so, it's a beautifully green town, and it's right next to the Ganges. But these fields that you see, this and the river flows somewhere over there. The city has no connection to the river at all. So, as a result, these green rolling fields, there was vacant land and then the planned city, all the slums cropped up in the periphery of the city right next to the river. So, they actually have the best environmental affordances in the city. And so, these fields where we actually saw the kids playing the first year we went, and then these drains were put. And of course, again somebody must have gone and, okay, I have laid so many running length of drain. The slope was completely ulta. As a result, the water, instead of flowing where it should flow, it went and discharged in, there was a pond inside, and with the water, it's an open drain, so all the refuse, garbage also comes. So, this used to be a nice community pond, today has become a garbage pond, and then it also discharged directly into the fields. So, these verdant fields, which were an asset and actually the green lung of the city, today again have, when we went back the second year, we were amazed to see the level of filth and sewage in the field itself, and this was a direct contribution of this project. Of course, when you have these open drains and you know, in tight slum situations, children have nowhere else to play, they are playing in the streets. So, they are playing whatever it is, surreptitiously they will be going and picking up their whatever they have fallen into the drain directly, next thing you know, the hand is going into the mouth. And of course, with stored water also, that is the same story, because they do not use scoops or anything, they directly put in a cup or they scoop out water with their hands, and then the entire bucket is contaminated. Similarly, also when you have inadequate drainage, these are the perfect conditions for breeding grounds of all kinds of vectors, which are, you know, cause so many diseases in this particular context. And this, of course, because I said the slopes are all wrong in many of the drains, this leads to waterlogging in these contexts. Garbage disposal is the biggest, I think, problem in all these contexts, even after redevelopment. This award-winning slum project, this was the only open space available in this area, and the local councillor with local MLAs and all promised this as a playing ground to the children of this area. Now, Trivandrum, you may have heard, they had this whole thing with their landfill, the Villapisala treatment, where the entire garbage of the city used to go, and so they, before lining the field, they started discharging into it, and so the villagers got up in arms and they stopped the garbage trucks from coming in. So, for 2 years the garbage of Trivandrum was not picked. You know, I have relatives in Trivandrum and I visited over many years, and so in the peak of the garbage crisis, and in their posh neighborhood, which used to be this nice green sleepy little suburb, you couldn't enter without, you know, finding it difficult to breathe, because garbage has not been, and these people, and these are educated people, so they'll come out in the middle of the night and put the garbage on the street. And so on both sides of these streets were these garbage accumulation for 2 years. So you can imagine what's happening in a slum. And right across from this slum is a big vacant lot, which is the city's sort of impromptu dumping ground. So this entire space, the only space which was available to the children, went. Similar stories everywhere, only again in Gandhinagar, because there was fantastic local leadership which organized a lot of the local services, it was picked up twice a day. This is the slum that I was talking about in Kerala. So of course, and they're still playing on the garbage. And there's also a lot of medical waste here, because there was a hospital nearby, so they came and dumped their stuff here too. Again, you know, breeding ground for rats. And one of the things that these, when we talk to these slum dwellers as to the positives of the development, they said, now we don't, and also one more thing I forgot, this green that you see, it's a massive sewage pond. This entire slum was around a sewage pond, and there's also a history of its development. It's very close to the Padmanabha Swami temple. So this is where the water of that temple drained into originally, and now it has become a sewage pond for the entire city. So anyways, it's a completely untenable site actually for in situ redevelopment, but that's a different argument. So they live with rats and snakes and, you know, bandicoots and all that. So that had gone in the flats, but because of this garbage crisis again, they were witnessing all these rodents coming back into their lives. You know, when you're talking about children, you have to talk about play and recreation, because that is the natural activity, and whether you provide for it or not, it's going to happen anywhere and everywhere. So where do children play? None of these projects actually focused on it, because their focus was really just the converting a kacha house into a pakka house or giving a flat. So it was happening impromptu in many places. Many of them were very, very risky places, like in Karimadam redevelopment again. Though they had created this, there were many phases to this project, and there were some pockets of previous development, and what they did, they made no attempt to connect the developments across as a seamless entity. So iske baad there's a older government housing, so the road stopped, and it was like this war zone over here. All the debris of the new project was there, wo somebody else's backyard, and then the existing slum. So how are the children supposed to be playing? These are the only open spaces which are shown as play spaces in their plan. But this is the ground reality. And then there's encroachments. Now all these shops are on their flats, they cannot have their micro enterprises. So a lot of these shops started coming up on the public space also. And this is something that we as an organization work on very strongly, this whole, the need for right to play, because it is so intricately related to so many other rights of children, and we don't even discuss it in our culture because we think it's a waste of time, but we should if we want to really promote happy, healthy childhoods, because it's in such strong connections to health, development, survival, education, cognitive learning, social well-being of children, at so many levels. Pretty much only in Trivandrum there was a new Anganwadi provided, but again there was no outdoor play space or anything, though there was a space, and right in front of the Anganwadi was the electrical substation. So if you come out, where do they go? You know, it's like one no-brainer after no-brainer, but yet it's all messed up on the ground, you know, and it also speaks to the lack of supervision or accountability. There may be a vision which looks very pretty, you know, architects' drawings look very pretty, like the model of Terry University you have down there, and so there were such models shown to this community also to sell the project, but no one really knows where is the servicing going to go into, how is the utility going to be plugged in. We don't talk about those things, like even the parking, the way it's shown. I was looking at it in your Terry University model, and I was thinking, I mean, do they still do parking like this and eating up on vital space? You know, there's so many ways of dealing with these problems. There are so many solutions, but it's not really worked on. This was the Anganwadi I talked about earlier in Bhubaneswar. This is a rented premise, and you can see the quality of this Anganwadi. There's no light, there's no electricity. It's dank. It's like a family is staying there, all their clothes and possessions, and still working as an Anganwadi, which is a violation of the norms. Cooking is happening under the staircase on this kacha floor, and the children are sleeping all here, you know. So what they do is they don't actually stay there. They all are outside in the slums. The Anganwadi is just working in name. The kids are always outside, because of course you cannot have 40 kids in a room like this, a dark, dank room. We come to affordability. The task force, the GUI task force, which sort of looked at this thing when this was being conceptualized, said that the pricing of this should preferably within the 5 times of the annual income of the household. Typically, we found that the cost of the house varied from 3 to 10 times the annual income of the household. So, which led to families taking on a lot of loans, a lot of which I referred to, the child labor thing, that kids being pulled out, dropping out of school at the age of 14 to supplement family income, and it was also a lot of hidden. In some places it was very visible, like in Kerala, Karimadam, we found those kids working in these meat shops and working like insane hours throughout the day, just chopping up all kinds of things, and they were also responsible for discarding the carcasses. In Kalyani, for example, it was very hidden. When we first went in, they said no child labor, we don't do anything. Then once we went during the summer holidays, and subsequently after that, and we found all these in these homes, women sitting and rolling beedis, and none of the children were around. So we said, where are the children? So, oh, there's a beedi factory which is deep hidden, well hidden inside the slum. So they all roll there, and the boys, and they're very strong gendered roles assigned. So the women have to roll the beedi. It's the boys, young boys, who have to push the stuffing in and put the thread, and then again you need a young girl to tie the thread. It was like an assembly line that was happening there, and then also packing the beedis, you know, in certain amounts, and they were all being actually exported out. So this activity was happening, and it's not only a vacation activity. They roll beedi in the morning before go to school, and as well as coming back, and the women carried back home for just making the shells. So this was going on all the time, and because there was nothing, either they're domestic workers or they're rolling beedis. Habitability, this is also very interesting, because this is something which continues even today, this thing of 25 square meters of house area, but BSUP very clearly defined that within that you have to give 2 rooms, 1 kitchen, 1 balcony, 1 separate bath and toilet. And this is very important, because this most of these houses, you know, it's important to have the kitchen separate, and that these houses must have proper ventilation, natural lighting, doors and windows to have a wire mesh to keep mosquitoes away, etc. And then they asked for innovation, etc. They asked for disabled friendly housing, they asked for sufficient open space and green area within the colony, and it must be a socially cohesive, God knows what that is. So across the sites we found that this space norm was typically followed, except in Kalpana Nagar in Bhopal, and these were varying layouts. These are actually houses which are, they're in, each house has a different footprint because they are in situ. Whatever the, if the family had 100 square feet, so the ground floor is going to have 100, then they'll put another 100 on top, and like a cake put 50 on top. So that's your 250 square feet, and every house was custom designed. Mother Teresa Nagar was a crazy exercise that way. Very committed architects who worked with the community, and average number of revisions of a design after it had been sanctioned by the corporation was 5.5 times. I would have gone crazy if I had to design 200 houses and then do a revision of 5 times on each of them and get community sanction and get corporation sanction. It was a crazy process. Gandhinagar was smarter that way. It was again very community driven. So people got to design their own homes. So every house is different. These are the typical templates in these. These also followed a typical template, even though they were in situ housing. But there were the trends that we saw in many cases, even though people always will say crib, in many cases, most cases, they actually got more living space than what they were having in their slum housing. They may have stayed on 450 square feet, but then there were 10 people staying in that house. Here, now it's by household typically. So you had 4 to 5 people in 250 square feet. It was mostly true. In some cases, there were some exceptions. Only in Kalpana Nagar in Bhopal, the allotment was not done by household. So whoever was occupying, if there's a family of even, and this was a Muslim community, very poor. So households comprised of 10, average number of members were 9 to 10. So those 9 to 10 people were then cramped into the 220 square feet flat, which is just one room with a toilet and a very tiny kitchen. So no storage was actually provided anywhere. Cooking space also, this is the state of Kalpana Nagar housing. This is new BSUP housing. This is its condition. And this is again because all those guidelines about innovation, people friendly design, etc. You do not understand how people live, what their requirements are. When you are providing, house is not a shell. It's a way of life, and you have to cater to that lifestyle. So there's an innate need for storage, and poor people do not have furniture. They cannot buy these things. So, you know, they will do their own jugaad. A lot of these Cooking practices, culturally, this is in Kerala, it's a rice eating community. So the whole thing is designed for keeping a gas, but gas is so difficult in Kerala, you have to wait a long time to get a gas. Sometimes the wait is about 2 months. So they use their chulas, the rice chulas, and this is what happens, and the indoor air quality and everything. At least here there is a window. Now, if you look at, we talked about within habitability, you have to talk about structural safety and of these buildings, and very much so we found that, again, from a children's perspective, they've, particularly in the Pune houses, which are these vertical small footprint houses, they've put these ladders, steel ladders, and then these cutouts in the floor which are literally like death traps. You can imagine, I mean, there was an old woman we visited, it's so sad. She had broken her head because she was sleeping and she rolled and she fell 3 floors through that. And then we even went in and found this newborn babies being kept on the floor, the mother working 2 levels down, cooking whatever, and again this unprotected cutout. So these are, again, when you don't take into consideration people's systems, a lot of these things happen. In the previous slide, also in Kalpana Nagar, they had a flat terrace, they had provided no access to it. So people went and broke the slab, the roof slab. So you can imagine what's going to happen to the structural safety of their entire floor to go to the roof, which was a recreational space. So many, like they provided a staircase and a landing, if even for a child there is no headroom to come under, and this is the access through and through. And there were so many such, like open staircases going up, unprotected terraces, this completely exposed electricals. There was like everywhere that you see, you had these things, and these are all very award-winning projects, many of them. So location-wise, all the slums had fantastic location because they were all in situ redevelopment. They were not relocated at all, which also brings up many questions, particularly in the case of 2 of the slums that we looked up, which is Karimadam, which is right next to the sewage pond of the city, and in Jathrodi, which is right on next to the railway track. Even though it's a defunct, pretty defunct track, but sometimes a wagon does come. So this is why the injunction on the land and all that. So this really, there's a need to question this whole discussion on tenable and untenable land. Over here they said it's too political, we cannot move the community, but here this is a complete environmental nightmare to have a slum redevelopment next to the sewage without treating it, without doing any kind of environmental adjustments. And very important when we are talking about children, this is Gandhinagar slum in Pune, or any slum for that matter. Children are not confined to this little slum. They are going to schools, they are going for play, they are working in the market, they are going for recreation. Typically, there is a 2-kilometer radius that we mapped that they navigated, but the focus of redevelopment will always be only the slum and nothing else. When you do that, you are failing everybody because you are not looking at the traffic mess outside or the conflict points and the garbage and the dangers in the local area. A slum is very much a part of the city, and this brings this whole discourse on informality and looking at informal systems. They are not ghettos that just needs this kacha pakka formula for redevelopment. This is another slum in Pune, similar story, Mother Teresa Nagar. When we and the reason why we need to provide sidewalks, the reason we need to have stoplights, the reason we need to have road calming, traffic calming measures is because traffic accidents is the single biggest killer of children in the unnatural death category across the world. And this is now a proven fact, and for girls and younger children especially, they are not allowed to step out anywhere because this issue of that it's an unsafe environment. Accessibility, we said there's absolutely no accessibility, and then when you're carrying water up the stairs 3-4 floors on your head, the injuries to your spine, to your back, tremendous. Cultural adequacy, this is also very interesting because a lot of these in Pune, for example, water, for the first time in a lot of these places water was metered and they were not willing to pay for it. In Pune, it's a higher income community comparatively, so they were still paying, but they will pay for the drinking water. Now what about and the cooking fuel. The gas is again very, very costly. So, they were not going to use the water that comes in, that they are paying for let us say washing utensils or for bathing water in winter, and they are not going to use fuel for warming water for bathing. So, they will still put out these firewood chullas outside the house in the street, heat their bathing water, get the water from the source, the standpipe, wash all their utensils outside the house, completely destroying the street in front. So, these are again cultural nuances, and you have to see how the practice can be taken care of when you are pricing it at a cost that is not acceptable to the community. Then you have to work on behavior change, but then it also has to be socially and economically acceptable. Similarly, in West Bengal, we found that they are so used to this elaborate meals, and the kitchen slabs were tiny, they will still be sitting on the floor and cooking. And in both these Bhubaneswar and Kalyani, we found several instances of young children being involved in kitchen fire related accidents. In here, there was a child who came running in, and the mother was cooking. She had a little catering business, so she had a full of karai full of hot oil, and the child fell in that. So, there are these stories also, you know, coming out to why a lot of these guidelines are framed in certain ways which were good, but they are not implemented. Cultural adequacy also talks about, in Karimadam for example, there was a madrasa in the middle of the slum. It was a predominant Muslim community. In the redevelopment plan, they came up with these ideas of study centers for boys and girls, and no madrasa was going to be given back to the community, which was a disaster, because this was the only socially acceptable legitimate space where boys and girls could come together. And it also had a little space in front, so it was also an evening recreation spot where they would play games and they would learn. And these gender segregated study centers were going to completely take that away, not provided for. Similarly, a lot of these things, like people do these things of you know, clothes washing platforms and all in the upper floor flats. They were doing it in their terraces, and in this case they had terraces, or else they would do it outside. In terms of economic sustainability, again, there were no opportunity, there was none of these designs or the plans had any opportunity for incorporating home based work, which a lot of, and she was the only income earning member of the family. Similarly, there were these other things of in all the places, because they didn't allow mixed use in the housing, there were many cases where people were involved in Pune we found their butcher shops, which was taken out completely. There were things of chip making, you know, they were making jackfruit chips and this thing. So, the garbage that would accumulate, so the neighbors started, so they would peel and they would throw from the top flat, and it will fall on somebody's terrace or in front of their house. So, it was not acceptable, it had to pack up. It didn't really understand these nuances, and of course, in a flat there's opportunities for subletting are very less. Social equity, there was hardly any access provided to any kind of community facilities, including health, education, child care, play, recreation, etc. No protective services. We talked about substance abuse, child labor, domestic violence, etc. None of those safety nets were provided. Environmental sustainability, very, very tokenist green strategies. In some cases, particularly in Karimadam, they talked about we are going to do bio fencing. When you have a sewage pond right middle of your thing and you're not even doing anything about it, you're leaving the entire slum like a war zone. You're not even leveling the ground, and then they go and invest. They go and buy these plants and they put these supposedly biofencing, which was eaten up in no time by the cattle. So, that was a waste of money. It could have been done. They talked about smokeless chullas at the beginning, which the community rejected for some reason. So, but there were many other things, like there was no rainwater harvesting that was actually implemented. There was talked about, but it was not done. They talked about some biogas plants, etc. especially for lighting, doing street lighting, etc. They could have easily done solar. None of this was done. So, a lot of very, very tokenist gestures. Participation, pretty much across the board we found that maybe in the survey, where baseline surveys existed, the community was involved and young people were involved, college students in Kerala. To some extent, they were involved in community mobilization for getting people out of their old homes into the new homes. Planning and design, only in case of 3 projects we found people's involvement in that, actually 4 projects. House design, in all the incremental in situ typologies, yes. Participation by women and children, women yes, children no, and there were hardly any structures. Structures existed in many places. In Karimadam in Kerala it did, in Pune it did, in Kolkata and Bhubaneswar. Kolkata it didn't actually, but Kolkata took a very interesting approach of making people, so we, using the framework that I talked about of these 10 points that we used, we created a matrix for evaluating these case studies, and we found the case study that sort of came up on top is this Gandhinagar in Pune. It's not a very high scoring case study, it cannot be because many parameters were not met, but interestingly there was and both these are in situ incremental housing, these blues are flatted. These 2 flatted typologies both happened through NGO participation. So, they did manage to mobilize communities quite a bit. Both these again happened through very intense community led processes and NGO participation in Maharashtra. These were people, in this case people did not even know that there was a housing coming up next to them. When they thought it was a school or something, when it was finished, the bulldozer came, packed them up, put them there. So, they had not been able to collect any of the beneficiary amount from the people, because the officials will be killed if they enter that complex now. Across the board this is a problem. So, this is where I come back to my first point that I started with, that why is there a need to focus on children, that this is on, by any account, this is a very good slum redevelopment project, Gandhinagar, Pune. Fantastic local leadership that mobilized the community around issues and interests. They had a blueprint for development, so he managed to sustain community engagement. Many very good NGOs were involved who worked with the community. There were technical expertise given to them, open-minded ULB, which had a UCB, Urban Community Development Cell within it, who were open to experiments, etc. So, all these were positives which actually made Gandhinagar stand out quite a bit. Despite all this, we still see that there were many failures of Gandhinagar, which particularly failed children, and this is the reason why I talked about that this overall one size fits all approach does not lift all boats, that particularly for children you have to have a very nuanced, focused understanding. And the reasons for that I will give you. In this case, how did it fail children? BSUP talked about when they did very extensive data gathering at the beginning. No data was collected on children's well-being at the beginning. It was, other than how many children in the family, they did not even collect any data related to immunization, schooling, etc., all the social entitlements, which could have been which by mandate is part of this project. Unsafe social environment, there was no social audits done of any kind as to what are the current social ills in this community. There's so much of the adolescent girls, the lack of mobility, the kind of sexual harassment they face, there's so much problems with the drunkards in the community. Lack of social infrastructure, there is social infrastructure in the community, but they don't work. Like for example, there are community halls, there's even a gym which is provided by the municipal corporation, but there's no equipment, the community hall has no equipment, it's part of it serves as an Anganwadi. So there are, naam ke vaste, there are a lot of things, but they don't work. And in the startup of the project, there should have been a social audit of some kind, which should have looked at what exists and what works and what doesn't work, and it could have been integrated with the project. Lack of play spaces. When they did this thing, they could have easily seen that there are absolutely no community open space at all in this area. So they could have linked up some way of safe access to open spaces around to the community, which children were anyways seeking out. Now, I talked about this thing, the cultural failures of this project. So, he is going to wash his clothes in the standpipe water and the utensils right outside the house, though there is a perfectly good toilet and kitchen inside and a roof. So, the roads are slippery. Most of the people are washing, so this is soap water, and this is, and then they would come out and heat the water for all the domestic use. So, it's smoke filled, and then even though there is garbage collection, people would still not wait for that actual collection time. As soon as they have garbage, they will throw it out. So, these are also things which actually requires a lot of attention, focused attention on behavior change, because this is again the only social space in the community and it is not available. Water storage, these big water drums that you see, and I talked about it because children scoop out water with their hands, with a glass, whatever it is. It's also, we found in many of these communities, the water tanks, when they are very naughty and it's seen as a space for punishment for younger children, mothers would just dunk the kids in this, not a very full tank, half a tank, and put the lid on top. It was a space so that she has 5 minutes of respite. And these are again social practices which are very scary and it needs addressing. So, these are some of the things that we looked at, and it was an eye opener when you see things with a different lens. In many of these places, there were these informal networks of children. They would get very active before a festival, collecting money. They call Mitra Mandals or Yuva Sanghs or whatever it is, and they'll play carom or these outside games. But they could have, because this place had a very strong focus on community participation and the women's groups were very active, they had made no attempt to integrate children into those networks or formalize the children's networks as in many other places. And this whole thing that the slum is a part of the city is not in our current thinking of slum redevelopment, because we still see it as this ghetto of underdevelopment where we need to bring in services, we need to bring in pakka houses, and we need to bring in some infrastructure to upgrade people's lives. But people's lives are not localized in the slum alone. They move around, particularly women and children, and you have to make the entire local area safe for them. So, and these were some of the kids that we worked in, and they, when we asked them to develop their sort of the mapping of the slum, and they came up with fantastic detailed maps, which, and we said, this is the kind of information we should have gathered in during the design and planning process, not after a fact. So yeah, so that is our sort of little study.